The world of Jesus is a weird world. I don't know, like we tend to if you grew up in the church, for sure. If you've been in the church a long time, we tend to sort of see the world of Jesus as something that just works and makes sense and everything's right. And the reality is the world of Jesus is kind of a weird place. We did this a little bit last week, but losers are winners. If you're supposed to sit at the head of the table, you sit at the back of the table. Those who are poor are lifted up. The oppressed are broken free. This is a weird world, and somehow we've normalized it as if, oh yeah, that makes sense totally. As Jeff reminded us, walk 2 miles with that. If somebody asks you, turn the other cheek. Those are not normal things, right? So this is kind of a weird place, and we need to name that. We need to recognize that. And then the next thing we need to do after that is say, okay, if it's so normal to us, or somehow this is so normal for us, then what are we missing about our own culture and our own society that we're not addressing as we move into our faith and take that into the world? Because I promise you, there was nothing normal about Jesus in his day, and there was nothing normal about the early church as they worked out what the church was supposed to look like. This was countercultural stuff. And we don't look very countercultural most of the time. So there's probably something that we're missing. That's the point of that. I want to start with a story about our people. This is that story that when the church told their story, when Jesus told the story of God, this is where it began. We're coming up on Easter. My favorite text to preach on, and so I'm going to name it today, and that probably means I can't talk about it near Easter, but is this moment. Jesus has been crucified. He's returned. And there's a moment with a couple of guys on the road to Emmaus that totally changes their world. What I love about it is that they had thought something different was supposed to occur. These guys knew everything that was going on. They were good people. They were following God. They thought, and Luke puts it this way, they thought this was the person to restore the kingdom of God. But clearly we were wrong. That's kind of how they put it, right? And so something happens as Jesus tells the story, and he begins way back in the story of Israel. You see, the God of Israel is the God that heard the cry of their people. Our people, their people, some people, anyway. They were oppressed. They were in slavery. Our people, we could say, were in a place of total misery and desperation. There was no way out. In fact, hope was so unlikely and unrealistic that when Moses said to the people, we're going to go and talk to them, they said, no, don't do that. Anytime you get involved, something gets worse for us. What you're trying to do isn't realistic. But God had heard the cry of our people. God had heard the cry of the marginalized, of the oppressed, of those enslaved, and stepped in and eventually led them out of the land of Egypt. This is the God that we're talking about. This is the critical story that we tell about our God. The moment that God steps in is a moment of liberation. And that wasn't enough for our people. They wanted to look like all the other kingdoms. They wanted the power in the land. They wanted the wealth of the land. They wanted the control and the socioeconomic status that came with kingdoms and principalities. And God said, you're really not going to like this. But God gave it to us anyway. And turns out, we did exactly what was expected. We took the power, we took the wealth, we took the control, and we exerted that power over others, just as had been done to us. Turns out we don't handle power very well. Turns out God was calling us to something different. And a few people throughout that story get it. We're reminded again and again, God doesn't want your sacrifices. God wants you to love and care for his people. That beautiful line, God desires mercy, not sacrifice. This is a different upside down world that we're talking about. And true to form, when Jesus comes to the scene and we are expecting an overturning of the kingdoms and principalities, a power that is real and tangible that we can control and grasp, God reminds us again, this is not the kind of power that you are looking for or that we are talking about. And that's what that story of Emmaus does so well. Because they say to him, he walks alongside. They don't know who he is. They were talking together about all the things that had happened. And he said to them, what are you discussing? And they stood still, looking sad. And one of them said, are you the only stranger in Jerusalem that does not know the things that have taken place in these days? And he says, I think a bit cheeky, oh, what things? The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and to be crucified. But we had hoped, this is that moment, we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Israel, the land. Israel, the kingdom. Israel, the principality. And he says to them, after some more explanation, oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe that all the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should have suffered these things and then enter into his glory? Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself and all the scriptures. He began to describe to them how upside down this world really is if you are following and loving God. From the very beginning, this is the upside down world that he has in mind. Something has gone awry if we're not catching that glimpse as we look into the story of Israel, into the story of Jesus. We've sort of been tying this to with Colossians, which if you just read it straight up, Colossians is actually, it's a bit bland. It's kind of not that, it's not exciting, and the context is key. But Paul opens this letter with a poem about the kingdoms and principalities. But really, it's actually about Jesus. And just as a reminder, that statement is a statement that God is overturning the way we look at the world. Because everything we know about the world of Jesus and the early church are the Romans. Caesar is in charge. Caesar was at the beginning of everything. This is a godlike character. Anyone watch Moana? I've been listening to the soundtrack, like looped. Anyway. The way the demigod in the story tells about all the things he's done for humanity, this is the world that Caesar lived in. As if Caesar wrangled the sun down closer to give us the seasons and the warmth, and pulled the moon in to give us tides just for fun, and continues down this line. This is the world that Caesar lived in. This is the world that the Romans lived in. Caesar is in charge. Caesar has been at the beginning and forefront. He has given you peace. He has given you wealth. He has given you this kingdom. And if you're on top, man, you are on top of the world in the Roman world. But the flip side of that is if you're on the bottom, it is not a peaceful place. God had something different in mind than replacing Caesar with a king, than replacing the Roman world with Israel. God had a plan to undo all of those expectations and things that we live differently, that the world looks differently, at least through our eyes. So as we go through here, we're talking, what does that look like? What does this mean? What does it mean to live in an upside down world? What are the kingdoms and principalities today? This is a real question. What do you got? What are we up against? Walmart. Oh, I love it. What a beautiful place to start. What else we got? Hollywood? I heard something else. Trump? So the question has to be, okay, so those are beautiful. Like, so we just named consumerism, like entertainment world, and some really sketchy political powers, right? I'll put my own words into that. So what does an upside down world look like if we are taking Jesus, if we are taking God at their word and living into a space that looks different and lives differently? It's a hard question. There's nothing easy about this. Last week we talked about a gentleman in East Vancouver that took his family to live on East Hastings, inviting people in daily for dinner off the street. We don't all have the guts or the ability to make that work. And we're not all, let me be clear, that's beautiful, it's amazing. We're not all called to that either. So how does the upside down world fit into your space, your family, your community? I want to talk this morning as we move, because I want to be practical here. It's nice to talk about overturning consumerism and selling all our goods and giving it to the poor. These are some really high ideals, but we want to be practical in what can we make different in our own life. I'd like to talk about relationships to start with, or not to start with, but today. Relationships. I I was first thinking about family and how the sort of family dynamics occur. We have roles that we play in our family. We have expectations put on us as the youngest child, the oldest sibling, the parent, the husband, wife, or other. We have expectations placed on us. The way the family dynamic system works. Most of our relationships have a mutually beneficial aspect that is at the core of why that relationship functions. Jesus turned relationships over as well. So we're gonna move from relationships to our work environments later on, to how we spend money after that. I'll give you a warning so you can skip. But relationships have at the core this idea that we are going to get something out of them. Well, let's be honest. Pretty much everything we do, if we're honest about ourselves, everything we do has a, what am I going to get out of this relationship if I'm going to proceed? Relationship, job, activity for school or recreation or whatever it is. Rarely are we doing something truly to benefit another without any reciprocal feedback from that. There's a moment in Jesus' ministry that I think highlights what happens here and how we change relationship dynamics to an upside-down world kind of way. You see, Jesus is teacher, he's the rabbi. He's the one in charge. These guys have dropped. He's got these guys following him everywhere he goes. They have dropped everything. They've left their parents. They've left their families. They've left their businesses. They've left wealthy work. They've dropped everything to follow him. Very noble, very admirable. There are expectations for what he is to provide and how they are to treat him. Now, before the festival of the Passover, we're reading in John chapter 13, if you'd like to join me. Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart from this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. Knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going to God, he got up from the table, took off his outer robe, and tied a towel around himself. He poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was tied around him. That's gross. Feet are gross today. They were really gross then. You didn't have your servants wash feet, okay? Because it's gross. And they lived in a different culture. Feet literally are unclean. Feet, you don't do it. You don't do this. You wash your own feet because you can't expect anyone, however lowly, to do that on your behalf. The teacher gets down on his knees and moves from disciple to disciple to wash their feet. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" And Jesus answered, "You do not know now what I am doing, but later you will understand." And Peter said to him, "You will never wash my feet." And Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no share with me." You see, the relationship dynamic is literally flipped upside down or thrown out the door or something else. Has anyone, if you've been in church for a while, you might have come across someone who's like, "I'm going to make a cool statement and wash people's feet." Have you been in this? Dude, this is super awkward. I totally know where Peter's coming from. As beautiful of a moment that it is, and people in tears around the room because it is that awkward, or because it's that powerful, it is super awkward. You see, there are expectations placed on us in our family. And some of those we don't control. I mean, we have a history of our parents taught us this way, and that's how we're going to teach our kids, and our grandparents lived in this way, and so we have this value that's built into the family system. Some of these things have to be completely deconstructed from the inside out for us to even begin to ask the questions. But at the heart of what happens in this story is Jesus turns the relationship dynamic upside down and says, "No, I am going to serve you." And again, actually, Jesus puts himself in situations that flips the dynamics of the relationship. This is a particularly powerful one. Now, I've got a bowl of water here. I'm kidding. We're just going to talk about it. You could practice in your own home, though. Experience that with your family. We have a system that functions. We have power dynamics at play in our own families, between our children, between adults and our children. Have you ever gotten to that moment with your kids, if you have kids or grandkids, or you're babysitting or whatever, and you got to that moment and you're like, "No, we are going to sit here because there is no way I'm going to give in to my 5-year-old. Have you done that? Of course you have. There are dynamics built. And that doesn't mean you don't do that. That just means that we have expectations of what our control and struggle with living in relationship looks like. We have expectations that in romantic relationships that there is a certain thing that we're going to get out of this relationship. And a lot of times we don't allow ourselves to get beyond that expectation so that we can give and allow that to be truly a place of mutual giving, not a place of mutual taking. I don't begin to put myself in a place to say, "Watch me." But what I can see and what I know is that God is calling us to something different. And the world, our culture, the society, our own family expectations for generations expects us to live in a certain way. The liberative word of Jesus is that you don't have to. You don't have to live that way. Guess what? You get to evaluate where you're at and the traditions and the expectations placed on you and say, "You know what? Actually, that expectation doesn't look like Jesus, and I don't have to follow through with it. We're going to try something new. We're going to try me washing your feet." We're going to try me stepping back from an argument instead of full steam ahead like my personality demands, right? That's the upside down world of Jesus. And it happens broadly in our culture, and it happens on an individual level in our families and in our relationships. And we can continue to press on with our own needs and desires, or we can live into something new and fresh and genuine.